So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Thank you for showing up for our talk today. Marianne and I, along with a colleague, Deb Dunning, offer holotropic breathwork in England and work in various settings around the world with holotropic breathwork. We're converts of this methodology, that's why we're here. And it feels really good to be presenting to you today. Also worth saying is that our introductory talk to holotropic breathwork, when we're talking to people who haven't experienced this before, takes an hour as a minimum. So this is a real whistle-stop tour through holotropic breathwork, and I hope we can capture the essence of what we think you would like to hear. So the holotropic perspective arises from the work of Stanislav Groff. Oops, wrong one. He's a psychiatrist with more than 50 years' experience of researching the healing and transformative potential of non-ordinary states of consciousness. Also, as some people heard this morning, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology and a chief theoretician in this domain. And his cartography of the psyche is one of the major contributions to modern psychology. So his early research was with psychedelics in the 60s, where he explored the therapeutic potential of LSD and other psychedelic substances, initially in Prague at the Psychiatric Research Institute, and he later continued his research in the States at the Johns Hopkins University and the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. From the early 1970s, he was scholar in residence at Esalen in California. He was there until 1987. And it was at Esalen that he and his wife, Christina Groff, co-created and developed the practice of holotropic breathwork. What is holotropic? Well, the word is it's a Stan creation, and it comes from the Greek holos and trepine, which is interesting just on the back of the talk we've just had. So holos as in whole, trepine as in moving in the direction of. So when we're talking about holotropic breathwork, we're talking about a practice that moves us towards wholeness, moves us in the direction of wholeness. And we sometimes like to think about, as a reference point, thinking about the fact that plants are heliotropic. They grow, they're always moving towards the sun. Holotropic as human beings, that we have a natural propensity for growth, and that we're all always trying to move towards wholeness. So what actually is it? It's a practice that offers language, method, and structure for the experience of expanded or non-ordinary states of consciousness. Stan moves away, more recent years, he's moved away from the term altered. He sees it as a kind of label that describes expanded states of consciousness almost as something that shouldn't happen, that are dysfunctional. So he talks about non-ordinary states of consciousness or expanded states of consciousness. The underlying principle of holotropic breathwork is that we all have an innate wisdom, an inner healing mechanism. And we've heard this in various talks here as well, that we all have the capacity to heal ourselves within us. And the practice itself is non-directive. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual setup of holotropic breathwork, but it's a non-directive process. In essence, there are some fundamentals that you absolutely have to consider with holotropic breathwork. It's really important that it always involves preparation, session, and integration. We'll talk more about this as well in a little while. As part of the preparation, session, and integration, in each of these elements are underpinned by the fact that we create a safe set and setting for the work to happen, for the inner work to happen. And an underlining again of the fact that this is a non-directive process. So when we're talking about the inner healer, I mentioned we have an inner orientation towards wholeness and healing. So a quote from Stan that's gone a bit wobbly, that holotropic states bring to consciousness that which has a strong emotional charge in us already, something that's psychodynamically relevant at the time and is most available for us for conscious processing. So you can think of it as when we enter a holotropic state, that we have a kind of inner radar that scans our unconscious and brings to consciousness the material which we most need to attend to. I'm just going to pass the mic over to Marianne to talk a little bit about Stan's cartography.
Delicate stuff. So Stan, hi. Wow, there's a lot of you. Stan's cartography of consciousness, as Holly mentioned, has had a big impact, and probably my guess is that in the future will have a larger impact as we look back on what is now considered modern psychology, just in the scope that he proposes and the expansion on the existing idea that we are born as a tabula rasa. You know, we're born, and onto that empty being that comes out of the mother at birth, we start to develop our personalities, our personas, and all the various fixations and problems and neuroses, et cetera, that we deal with in psychology. So for many of you, this is probably not news, but certainly during the second half of the last century, when Stan's work is so active, this was a big idea. The idea that actually we are formed, our psyches are formed before that, in the perinatal experience, and possibly even prior to that, in what might be considered transpersonal realms. So what he sees, or what he saw in his research, when he started to really look at the data that he was gathering, to understand the picture that he was getting from reports from his subjects in his literally thousands of sessions that he was supervising, and out of his own experience, was he started to see that not only were experiences arising out of the personal biography, you know, losses, loss of attachment, deaths, traumas, etc., that we're probably all fairly familiar with if we're working in non-ordinary states of consciousness. These high emotional loadings will arise, and we'll remember them, have memories, and work with them. But also there was these non-verbal, pre-verbal, somatic, energetic kind of emergence of feeling that would happen. Maybe it was physical expression, could be strong emotional expression, but not usually with much content. And his proposal was that this was connected, this was a memory that lived below the conscious mind that was remembering our pre- and perinatal experience. So very often, for those of you who did the rebirthing experience, you may have had some similar experiences there, where there's very strong impulses that live in the body. And if we think about birth, I mean, what an incredible, intense, traumatic experience. I mean, here you are, 60 pounds per square inch, something like that, pressurizing you through the birth canal. I mean, if nothing else, moving from an aquatic environment to a breathing environment, how can that not have a huge impact on us? So he proposed that there were 4 real regions of this birth, what he called the perinatal matrices. This kind of aquatic, the birth contraction starting, really from just the whole gestation period, where there's just this oceanic sense of safety, warmth, all your cares are taken care of. And then, in the best of environments, not always. I mean, sometimes this can be impacted by sickness, the mother's condition, external influences like violence, war, fear, anger. So, I mean, there are ways this is impacted, but that in general, this is a safe environment. The second stage, he suggests, is when the contractions start. Heavy, intense, I mean, feel it. The intensity of a contraction, and there's no way out. The cervix hasn't opened. So there's this kind of no exit period during the perinatal experience. Very powerful, hopeless, depressed, contained, pressurized, all of these experiences that we might be familiar with in the rest of our lives, but actually also have a somatic component that may be a memory from that stage. There's also this idea that when the cervix opens, there's a sense that there is then a movement that's taking place. And these massive pressures, the struggle literally for life and death. Am I going to make it? Is the birth going to happen? Can I actually move through the birth canal and have a happy conclusion here? So this is the place of experiences of being crushed, being torn apart, being faced with complete destruction and annihilation, and still there's a sense that I'm going to move through it. So enormous energies are at work here, enormous forces are actually putting me in motion. And then the fourth, as you might imagine, is the kind of yay breakthrough. Here I am, I made it. Hopefully the reception at the other end is pretty good. And there's this sense that of like the phoenix rising, in a way. The images of just triumph and maybe peace, absolutely finding my place, knowing that I'm welcome, hopefully, knowing that I'm loved. So there's this huge passage that's like a hero's journey that just is in this whole felt sense. And then, of course, Stan speaks to the transpersonal realm. So birth, as he very often found, the somatic birth memory is very often almost a transparent portal into transpersonal experience. So the hero's journey, as it's felt in the birth sequence, may also be felt literally as a hero's journey in the archetypal realm. It may be felt as battles with dragons, lions. It may be felt as meeting with gods and deities. It may be felt as elfin land, as some of us may know. It may be immersion in the natural world and the feeling of being an animal, being a bird, being a rock, understanding the pain or the love of entire humanity, or the global cosmic sense of peace and oneness and unity. So this in a way, his map sounds linear. It sounds like a kind of structure that we might go through. Okay, I'll go through my biological, my birth experience, and then I'll finally get to the transpersonal. But think of it as a kind of interpenetrating, multidimensional matrix of experience in which we are swimming, and that the holotropic experience opens us to all those dimensions, often simultaneously. We may focus and bring our focus to one aspect of this experience, and then it may foreground and background. And I know those of you who've had psychedelic experiences know this well. What I find, and I think we find in the breathwork, is that this map is a very useful way to start to make some sense out of the intensities of experiences that sometimes arise.
So what does a session actually look like? For a holotropic breathwork session, as I mentioned, there's always preparation, session, integration, and the preparation begins actually when people kind of sign up to have the experience, when we make connections with them. That's the beginning of the preparation, and there's very intentional preparation as we go into the experience. As I mentioned, a minimum 1 hour talk on an introduction to the practicalities, the kind of experiences people can have. The breathwork sessions themselves, to be a holotropic breathwork session, according to Stan and Christina Groff, the co-creators of this methodology, the session has to be a minimum of 2 hours long. The average is 2.5 to 3 hours that we would create a session for. We'll talk about that. Minimum 2 hours. There isn't a maximum, but minimum 2 hours, average 2.5 to 3. It's always done in pairs, always. There's always a breather who lies down on a mat, usually puts an eye shade on to really go internal with the process. And we have a sitter beside the breather who holds the space. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in detail, but breather who with an eye shade, internal process on a mat, a sitter holding the space, and facilitators. So typically this would happen in groups. We have a ratio of facilitators to breathers, always a sitter for each breather. Different formulas for doing it. We can do one-day events where there's just one session for a breather, and then the sitter swaps in the afternoon and becomes breather, and the breather becomes sitter. We have longer ones where there's time to breathe one day, integrate in the afternoon, sit the next day, breathe another day, integrate, sit. So various different formulas. So with the breather lying on the mat, a sitter beside the breather, and the facilitators in the room, one of the facilitators will do a relaxation. It's just a guided relaxation through the body, really supporting the breathers to let go of the outside world and take the focus in. And then towards the end of the relaxation, the person doing it will say something like, in a moment the music will begin and we wish you a wonderful journey. And at that point we start a carefully created music set. And really the music set determines the length of the intended length of the session. And this is crafted in a particular way with a particular trajectory. So the first third of the music has a rhythmic intensity to it, really supporting full deep breaths for the breather. Something like this in the beginning, no space between the in and the out breath, full deep breaths. And it really does encourage that. It's an invitation, it's the call to adventure. The next segment of the music we would think of as having emotional intensity. It's epic, it's heart music, it's big, it takes you through the whole spectrum of emotions and experiences in the background. And then the final hour is a come home now. It's gentle relaxation, meditative music. It's an absolute time to come home, come on, nearly there. It's kind of washing back up on the shore after the end of the really deep dive, or in the music terms, think of it as kind of going up into a kind of peak experience and then back down again in the last third. So relaxation, music, set and setting, breather, sitter, facilitator, relaxation, music and breath. When you hear Stan talking about how to do the breath, he just says there is not a technique for this. His exact words on a trip to China recently with the breath is, find your own rhythm, find your own rhythm. So there's an invitation to breathe more fully and more deeply, and perhaps to connect the in and out breath, at least in the beginning of the session, but really to find your own way with it. There's not an in, out, nostril, mouth, or a particular number of breaths per minute or per hour. And it's the combination of the safe set and setting, the focused breathing, the powerful music that enables the breather to enter into expanded states of consciousness. So it's really important to talk about sitting and facilitating and what those two elements bring. And we talk a lot in the training for breathwork about presence, sitter presence, facilitator presence, and what that is. And it's about being with the person who's having the experience. We're not the doers as sitters or facilitators. In fact, there's a practice of doing, not doing. We're there to be with the experience, to witness it, to support the breather, to have the fullness of the experience that their inner healing mechanism, their innate wisdom is bringing them. We follow the breather, and we'll often talk about what do. We practice doing, not doing. We're there to support the breather, not to change their experience in any way. And we support. So compassionate witness, presence, patience, love, putting our own agenda on the back burner and just bringing ourselves, mind, body and soul, into a place where we're absolutely there for the experience of the participants, of the breathers, for the whole session. And this is so important in the context of breathwork. This is part of creating a safe set and setting. It's part of the community experience that we share in the holotropic breathwork experience. And just in terms of, why are we talking about this here? Why are we talking at Breaking Convention? Why are we talking to psychonauts? This is the practice of sitting and facilitating. This is absolutely great practice for sitting for psychedelic sessions. This is where Stan and Christina's technique was birthed from. Stan's work with psychedelics in the 60s that became illegal, and then his desire to continue working with expanded states of consciousness birthed the methodology of holotropic breathwork. So as a practice for sitting for psychedelic sessions, it's a great training, and that's talked about a lot in the breathwork training community. And as a practice, if you're a therapist, if you're a sister, if you're a mother, a father, a daughter, if you're a human being who cares about other people, it's a great practice to allow us to be present with human beings, human experiences. I'm a psychiatric nurse, a renegade psychiatric nurse, I have to say. And you know, one of my missions as a service developer in the NHS has been bringing the holotropic perspective into mainstream mental health services to support people not to talk about how we shut people down. Let's not talk about medicating people and locking in symptoms. Let's talk about how we can sit with somebody while they're having the experience they're having. How do we be with them? And whether that's in a mental health context or whether you're with somebody who's grieving, and we've got to shut down the grief because we're uncomfortable. You'll be okay, you'll be okay. In the context of breathwork or with the holotropic perspective, we would stay with, how are you doing? That's it, you're doing great, stay with it. See if you can really let that come. So allowing the emergence of symptoms, if you want to talk about pathology, or allowing the emergence of who we are, if you want to talk about human experience. I need to stop because space for Marianne, but this is the essence of sitting, of facilitating, and of what we're talking about when we talk about presence that can be applied to many, many, many different settings. Love to talk more.
Sorry, not very handy with this thing. Okay, so yes to all that. This is so important in this kind of work, as you know. As is integration. Holly's background is in the mental health business. Mine is in learning, adult learning. How do we learn at a transformative level? So I'm very interested in this process of how we have experiences. We take ourselves into deep experiences. How do we actually integrate those experiences? And holotropic as a methodology is a beautiful example of taking people into deep experience, their own experience that is just generating out of themselves, and then creating space and actually a form for the beginning of a reflective process to make meaning, to understand and make meaning out of their experience, which is exactly how experiential learning happens. And so there's a couple of things just to say about that rather quickly before we close. One is that within the method of holotropic breathwork, there is the kind of integrative processes that we look at are the use of art. Following sessions, we encourage everybody to create mandalas. We've got a few examples here that people have done, collages, things like this. So there's actually a process. We have an art room set up where people can go. This guy is fantastic, artwork. And then we also encourage writing, journaling. We encourage people to talk to each other, tell each other the stories of their journeys. And then we also do sharing circles. So the whole group, or subsets of the group, will meet and actually, as in ancient human tradition, hear the story of the journey of the day, which is a form that I think also many of you who do community journey work will be recognized. What we also encourage in the breathwork is follow-up. So follow-up with others in the group, but also if we see people who are not complete in their session, it's part of our work as facilitators to follow up with them a few days afterwards, a week afterwards, and to stay in touch. So this is really, really important. What we're finding more and more is that we're having people coming to our workshops now who have had psychedelic experiences and may have had a not too good kind of ending, had experiences within their session which they've not been able to land for themselves, have felt shut down, or have been flooded with experience, which I can speak to out of my own experience of needing more time than was available in the situation that I was actually working in. So holotropic breathwork does create a space where what you bring, if that is what is really calling in your psyche, it will emerge. It won't emerge with the same intensity It may be somewhat different to the experience that you had in your session, but that you're in a place that's A, very well held, and B, you can stop the experience if you need to. So particularly in working with difficult experience, it puts you in the driving seat, which for some people who've had very, very intense psychedelic experiences is a good corrective. It actually allows a little bit of a dialogue with the material that they've been working with. What Holly didn't mention, I'll just mention very quickly, is that we have a form of energy release work that we work with in the breath work. It follows the breather. So again, when it's not something we come and do to people in the breath work, but if somebody's feeling a very intense somatic experience, a physical buildup of energy, one of the ways that we can work with people in the breath work is to encourage the expression of that energy. Sometimes, if I may, if Holly's feeling, I can actually give her resistance, and she can build the pressure and allow the expression to come. So somebody this morning was talking about the joy of being able to really shout, and sometimes even that level of release, which may not happen in depending on the circumstances of psychedelic work, can actually, that physical, energetic, emotional release can be enormously completing, actually, for the experience. So we're coming to the close here, and I suppose my closing would be, is what we're looking for in the holotropic breathwork in the way of closure is actually the completion of experience. Can an incomplete experience come to completion when we talk about integration? And if it can't fully complete, can we bring a person so that they're at rest enough in their experience and objective enough about their experience to be able to take it to the next round in their own way, using this kind of work at home, writing, journaling, talking, exploring, in their own space and in their own time. So, thank you. Thank you for being here.